They called it a wedding, but every system in the room knew it was actually a ceasefire held together by breath and fear. The Grand Elorian Peace Hall floated above the Capitol like a suspended shard of glass, its transparent alloy walls refracting the pale light of twin suns into thin blades across the marble floor below. Outside, orbital defense platforms hung motionless in synchronous orbit, their presence less like protection and more like a reminder of how fragile peace had become. Inside, silence carried weight. Every delegate from the Human Coalition and the Elorian Dominion stood or hovered in carefully measured positions, as if even shifting their posture too freely might fracture the agreement they had spent 3 years and 2 border skirmishes trying to preserve. At the center of it all stood Captain John Miller, hands relaxed at his sides, uniform simple, unadorned, almost deliberately unremarkable compared to the ornate military displays surrounding him. He looked less like a symbol of power and more like a man who had long stopped trying to appear like one. Yet there was something in the way he observed the room, not scanning, not assessing, but understanding, that made certain observers quietly adjust their assumptions without ever admitting it. Across the hall stood Princess Serafina Valsarar, heir to the Elorian continuity throne, her presence framed by ceremonial attendants and diplomatic advisors who spoke in whispers too precise to be casual. Her expression was controlled, almost carved from restraint itself, the kind of composure required of someone who had spent her entire life learning how to become a bridge between worlds that did not trust each other. Today, however, she was not only a diplomat. She was an offering, a living contract, a marriage arranged not by affection or tradition, but by calculated necessity. The union was meant to stabilize the fragile border accords, to bind human and Elorian interests through symbolic unity. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it felt like standing on a ledge and calling it a foundation. John did not move when the ceremonial announcement began. He simply listened as the protocols were read, as ancient legal frameworks were invoked, as words like unity, continuity, and mutual defense were layered over the unspoken truth that both sides were exhausted from pretending war was still a distant possibility. Serafina studied him from across the hall, expecting tension, hesitation, perhaps even ambition masked as humility. Instead, she found only calm. Not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of something that had already survived whatever this moment was supposed to represent. When their eyes briefly met, she felt no challenge in his gaze, no attempt to dominate the moment. Only awareness, as if he were noting the shape of a storm without fear of being caught in it. It unsettled her more than any political maneuver ever had. The final decree echoed through the hall, sealing the arrangement with formal precision. A marriage for peace, a bond for stability, a promise between species that had never agreed on what either of those words truly meant. Somewhere above them, the orbital stations adjusted their alignment by fractions of a degree, recalibrating for a future that no one in the room could fully predict. Serafina took one step forward, then another, the sound of her movement absorbed by the vast silence of the hall. John remained still until she was close enough that even the smallest shift in breath felt shared between them. For a moment, neither spoke. There was no declaration of intent, no romantic pretense, only the quiet acknowledgement that whatever came next would not belong entirely to either of them. And as the ceremonial interface systems activated around their joined signatures, sealing the agreement across interstellar networks, Serafina had a fleeting, uneasy thought she could not yet name. That she was not stepping into a marriage at all, but into proximity with something the galaxy had once tried very hard to forget. The first hours after the ceremony did not feel like celebration, but like entering a carefully controlled silence that had been engineered to prevent misunderstanding. The transition from public protocol to private residence occurred without ceremony, as if the system itself did not trust emotion to remain stable after such an agreement. The Elorian Sky residence was located in a geostationary habitat above the Capitol, its outer structure rotating slowly to simulate Earth's standard gravity, The interior corridors lined with adaptive light panels that adjusted their brightness to match the emotional calibration of authorized occupants. Princess Serafina Velsarar walked slightly ahead of John Miller, not out of impatience, but out of habit formed by years of diplomatic procession where every step had predefined meaning. John followed at a measured distance, observing rather than commenting. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had no intention of asserting ownership over space that had not yet been offered to him. Servants and administrative constructs moved quietly around them, each acknowledging Serafina with formal precision, and John with cautious neutrality, as if uncertain whether he belonged to a category that required protocol. When they reached the central chamber assigned as shared quarters, Serafina paused at the threshold longer than necessary, her hand hovering near the access panel before she finally initiated entry. The doors opened with a soft harmonic tone, revealing a space designed for two individuals who were expected to coexist, not necessarily to connect. The room was spacious, overlooking the curvature of the planet below, with transparent alloy walls that made the horizon feel close enough to touch. John stepped inside first, not inspecting the luxury, but the exits, the environmental controls, and the subtle placement of security emitters integrated into the architecture. Serafina noticed this immediately. Most dignitaries admired the view. He measured the room like a system awaiting failure. That realization introduced a quiet tension she did not fully understand. "You do not seem impressed," she said after a moment, her voice calm but carrying the weight of observation. John did not turn immediately. He placed his hands lightly behind his back, studying the planet below as if it contained answers rather than scenery. "Impression is not required for functionality," he replied. "This place was not built for comfort. It was built for stability." The words were not critical, simply factual, yet they lingered in the air longer than expected. Serafina moved further into the room, her attention shifting from him to the control interface embedded in the wall. "You understand our architecture," she said. "Not in detail," John answered. "But systems tend to reveal intent if you spend enough time listening to how they fail." That statement unsettled her more than she expected. Most humans she had studied through diplomatic briefings approached Elorian technology with either awe or frustration. He approached it as if it were a language he had once spoken and had not forgotten. She initiated a diagnostic sweep of the resident systems, partly as routine, partly to redirect her thoughts. The interface responded with subtle delays, recalibrating environmental harmonics in response to occupancy signatures. John noticed a fractional hesitation in the response cycle. "Your thermal regulation is compensating for a misaligned feedback loop," he said casually, almost as an afterthought. Serafina frowned slightly. "That should not be possible. The system was calibrated this morning." John finally turned his attention toward the interface, not touching it, only watching the pattern of response. "Calibration assumes stability," he said. "But this system is adjusting to external gravitational variance that was not accounted for in the original model. It is minor, but over time it will create uneven thermal distribution in the northern quadrant of the residence." Serafina studied him more carefully now. "You identified that in less than 1 minute." "It is not complex," he replied. "It is just overlooked." There was no arrogance in his tone, only simplicity, which made it more difficult to dismiss. She initiated a secondary diagnostic, and the system confirmed his observation almost immediately. A silence followed, different from the ceremonial silence of earlier. This one felt less controlled, more uncertain. Serafina realized she had expected him to remain distant, symbolic, perhaps even decorative in the political structure surrounding her life. Instead, he was interacting with the environment as if it were something malleable, something that could be understood and adjusted without ceremony. Outside the transparent wall, the planet rotated slowly beneath them, oceans reflecting sunlight like shifting glass. John returned his attention to the horizon. "You were not expecting this arrangement to involve participation," he said after a moment, not as a question, but as recognition. Serafina hesitated before responding. I was expecting predictability. John gave a faint nod, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. Predictability is usually the first assumption that fails, he said quietly. And for the first time since the ceremony, Serafina VRR felt that the agreement she had entered was no longer just a political structure designed to stabilize a fragile peace, but the beginning of an unknown system whose variables had not yet revealed their full range. The next cycle began without announcement, as if time itself had been programmed to avoid ceremony within the Elorian sky residence. Environmental lighting shifted gradually from deep orbital night to a soft artificial dawn calibrated to match Earth's standard morning cycles, though the transition felt more mathematical than natural. Serafina VRR had already been awake for several hours, reviewing diplomatic briefings projected in layered holographic displays that floated above the central table of the chamber. The information was dense, structured, and precise, yet her attention repeatedly drifted toward the quiet presence moving through the far side of the room. John Miller had not requested any schedule adjustment, nor had he been given any formal role for the day, yet he was already active, moving with calm intention through the residence, as if it were a system he had been assigned to understand rather than inhabit. He checked environmental nodes without interrupting their function, observed structural flow without interfering, and occasionally paused near interfaces that most occupants would ignore entirely. Serafina noticed that he did not behave like a guest waiting for instruction. He behaved like someone mapping equilibrium. At one point, an Elorian administrative advisor arrived accompanied by a floating data platform to review integration protocols between human and Elorian systems within the residence. The advisor, a tall figure with controlled posture and formal diction, addressed Serafina directly while treating John as peripheral presence. However, when a minor calibration discrepancy was reported in the residence communication relay, John spoke without raising his voice. He identified the source as a temporal synchronization drift between orbital signal relay and internal residence processing units, a misalignment measured in microseconds but sufficient to generate intermittent data lag across diplomatic channels. The advisor attempted to dismiss the concern as negligible, but within moments the system itself confirmed the deviation. Correction protocols initiated automatically, stabilizing the relay without manual intervention. The advisor's expression changed subtly, recalibrating his perception of the situation more than the system itself had recalibrated its timing. Serafina observed all of it in silence, noting not only the accuracy of the observation, but the lack of effort required to produce it. Later, during a scheduled diplomatic briefing with external Elorian Council representatives transmitted via secured holographic projection, the subject of the marriage arrangement resurfaced indirectly through formal language regarding alliance stability. One of the senior council members questioned whether symbolic unions involving human integration could maintain long-term political consistency, given unpredictable psychological variance in human decision-making. The statement was not hostile, but it carried the weight of institutional skepticism. Serafina prepared to respond through protocol-structured language, yet John spoke first without stepping into the center of attention. He stated that unpredictability was not equivalent to instability, and that systems relying entirely on controlled variables often failed when confronted with adaptive intelligence. The council member attempted to challenge the premise, requesting clarification on human historical precedent for such claims. John responded not with argument, but with observation, noting that every major expansion phase in human history had occurred during periods of structural uncertainty rather than absolute control, suggesting that adaptability was not a flaw, but an operational advantage. The chamber fell quiet for several seconds after his statement, not due to disagreement, but due to recalibration of assumptions. Serafina studied him more intently now, realizing that his presence in diplomatic space did not conform to expected categories of participant behavior. He was neither advocate nor representative in the traditional sense. He functioned more like an external reference point that exposed weaknesses in established reasoning frameworks without overt confrontation. After the briefing ended, Serafina remained seated while the projection dissolved into ambient light. The residence returned to its quieter state, though the psychological atmosphere had shifted in a way that was harder to measure than any system variable. She finally addressed John directly. "You did not need to intervene," she said. John stood near the edge of the chamber, looking briefly toward the orbital horizon visible through the transparent structure. "Intervention implies disruption," he replied. "I only corrected incomplete assumptions." Serafina narrowed her gaze slightly, not in disagreement, but in analysis. "You're not behaving like someone who is newly integrated into a foreign political arrangement." John paused for a moment, as if considering whether the question required translation into simpler terms. "Political arrangements are only unstable when participants assume roles without understanding function," he said. "I am still determining function." That answer lingered longer than expected. Outside the station, the planet rotated slowly beneath them, unchanged by the conversation occurring above it. Yet within the residence, Serafina became aware that the structure of her expectations was beginning to shift. John Miller was not resisting the system they had placed him inside. He was examining it as if it had already begun to respond to him. The shift in the residence became noticeable not through alarms or notifications, but through subtle variations in system behavior that only someone attentive to structural rhythm would detect. Environmental calibration adjusted itself, with slightly different timing intervals. Corridor lighting responded to movement with improved predictive smoothing, and even the ambient sound dampening algorithms recalculated their thresholds as if responding to a new form of presence rather than a new occupant. Serafina Voltarar observed these changes during her morning review of diplomatic correspondence, though she did not initially attribute them to anything beyond routine system optimization. John Miller had left the central chamber earlier without announcement, and his absence was noted more by the absence of his observational presence than by any physical trace. When she eventually moved through the residence corridors, she found him in one of the secondary engineering annexes, a space typically reserved for maintenance constructs and automated diagnostic units. He was not using any official interface. Instead, he stood near a structural access panel, observing the internal diagnostic flow projected faintly across the wall surface. An Alorian maintenance construct hovered nearby, its operational posture slightly adjusted, as if uncertain whether to classify him as authorized technician or diplomatic asset. John did not touch the panel. He simply watched the flow of data as if reading a language that had not yet been fully translated into structured meaning. "You are not scheduled for system access in this sector," Serafina said, her voice calm but precise as she entered the space. John turned slightly, acknowledging her presence without interruption to his focus. "Scheduling assumes separation between observation and participation," he replied. "I'm testing whether that separation is actually enforced in practice." The maintenance construct emitted a soft harmonic tone, indicating procedural uncertainty. Serafina approached slowly, her gaze moving between him and the diagnostic projection. "This is a restricted systems corridor," she said. "It is restricted by designation," John answered, "but not by necessity." He finally stepped back from the panel, allowing the construct to regain full operational priority. "Your environmental control system is not failing," he continued, "but it is compensating for an unreported variance in external orbital temperature flux. The adjustment is being distributed unevenly across structural zones, which creates minor inefficiencies in thermal equilibrium." Serafina folded her hands behind her back, studying him more carefully now. "That variance was documented in external sensor logs," she said. "It was classified as irrelevant to internal systems." John gave a faint nod, as if confirming a hypothesis rather than engaging in debate. "That is a common classification error," he said. "External conditions are rarely irrelevant. They simply appear disconnected until they are not." The maintenance construct adjusted its position slightly, acknowledging the correction with a brief tonal sequence before initiating recalibration protocols. Serafina watched the system respond in real time. The adjustment was subtle but measurable, You are treating our infrastructure as if it were part of a larger integrated system, she said. It is, John replied. It just has not been fully mapped yet. A pause followed, not filled with tension, but with recalculated understanding. Serafina found herself recalling earlier council discussions about unpredictability and control, and for the first time she considered that those concepts might not apply to him in the way they applied to everything else within her political framework. As they moved together back toward the central corridor, a scheduled communication alert activated from the diplomatic network. The residence interface projected a prioritized transmission request from the outer Elorian border observation fleet. The message carried elevated urgency classification. Serafina stopped walking. John did as well, his attention shifting immediately to the projection rather than the notification itself. The transmission stabilized into a structured report indicating increased unidentified movement along a contested orbital corridor. No direct engagement had occurred, but pattern analysis suggested coordinated positioning behavior inconsistent with routine navigation or civilian transit. Serafina's expression remained controlled, though her posture subtly tightened. "This is being escalated to the council," she said. John studied the projection for a moment longer than necessary, not analyzing the political implication, but the structural behavior of the reported movement. "That is not random," he said quietly. Serafina turned slightly toward him. "You recognize the pattern?" John did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his focus, as if aligning fragmented data into a coherent structure. "It is reconnaissance behavior," he said finally, "but not in the conventional sense. It is probing response latency across multiple defense layers." Serafina narrowed her eyes slightly. "You are certain?" "Certain enough to recommend immediate adjustment of outer relay response protocols," John replied. The residence interface paused, awaiting authorization input from Serafina. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before initiating command escalation. As the system processed her decision, she became aware that her hesitation had not been about trust in the data, but about trust in the source of that data. John Miller stood beside her, still observing the projection, his expression unchanged, as if a situation had already been accounted for long before it reached her attention. And in that moment, Serafina understood that whatever arrangement had been formed between them was no longer operating within the boundaries of ceremony or politics. It was beginning to behave like an adaptive system of its own, responding in real time to variables neither side had fully defined. The alert from the outer Elorian border observation fleet did not fade after the initial transmission. Instead, it remained active in the residence network as a persistent high-priority thread, continuously updating with incremental data packets that refine the same pattern without altering its core implication. The Sky residence shifted into a quieter operational state, as if the entire structure had entered a form of anticipatory analysis. Serafina remained in the central chamber, standing near the transparent wall that overlooked the planetary curvature below, her attention divided between the incoming data streams and the subtle presence of John Miller across the room. He had not moved toward command input stations or diplomatic consoles. Instead, he stood at a secondary observation interface, manually reviewing raw sensor feeds being relayed from orbital relay nodes. There was no sense of urgency in his posture, only concentration, as if the information itself was being assembled into a shape that already existed in his understanding. Serafina approached without announcing herself, stopping a few feet away. "The Council will request confirmation of interpretation within the hour," she said. "They will not accept partial analysis." John did not look away from the feed. "They should not," he replied. "Partial analysis creates false confidence." The sensor feed shifted again, displaying refined trajectory overlays from multiple observation points. The movement patterns along the contested orbital corridor had increased in density, forming structured clusters rather than random dispersion. Serafina studied the visualization. "Our analysts are describing this as probing behavior," she said. "Testing perimeter response." John nodded slightly. "That description is correct, but incomplete. She turned her attention fully toward him now. Explain. He finally stepped back from the interface, allowing the system to stabilize into automated interpretation mode. It is not testing perimeter strength in the conventional sense, he said. It is testing how quickly and consistently your systems respond to repeated low-intensity stimuli across distributed points. That is not preparation for immediate engagement. It is preparation for saturation of reaction logic. Serafina's expression remained controlled, but her eyes sharpened slightly. You are describing a systemic stress model. Yes, John replied, but applied across perception thresholds, not physical thresholds. A pause followed as the residence systems quietly recalibrated based on updated interpretation layers. Serafina processed the implications internally, mapping them against established doctrine. That level of coordination would require unified command architecture, she said. We have not detected such infrastructure. John's gaze returned briefly to the orbital projection. It does not require visible infrastructure, he said. Only synchronized intent distributed across autonomous units. The statement lingered in the space between them, heavy not with emotion, but with structural consequence. A secondary alert activated, this time originating from a lower atmospheric relay station. The data indicated a shift in energy dispersion signatures along the same orbital corridor, now extending into near-planetary approach vectors. Serafina initiated immediate review authorization. This is escalating faster than predicted models, she said. John observed the update without reaction. Predicted models assume linear escalation, he replied. This is not linear. The residence interface displayed a cascade of recommended responses from Ilorian strategic systems, each one increasing in defensive complexity. Serafina reviewed them in silence, then paused. What would you recommend, she asked finally, if you were integrated into command structure? John hesitated for the first time since the conversation began, not from uncertainty, but from calibration of context. I would recommend reducing response latency variance across all relay layers, he said, and removing unnecessary decision bottlenecks between detection and execution protocols. Serafina studied him carefully. That would shift authority away from council review cycles. Yes, John confirmed, but it would also reduce the window between recognition and response. The implication was clear without being stated further. Serafina turned back toward the orbital display. Outside the transparent structure of the residence, the planet continued its slow rotation, indifferent to the increasing complexity unfolding above it. For a long moment, she did not respond. The weight of institutional structure, diplomatic constraint, and political equilibrium pressed against the simplicity of the recommendation he had made. Yet beneath all of it, there was a growing recognition that the situation no longer behaved according to the assumptions that had defined its initial design. Finally, she spoke. If I authorize this adjustment, she said, it will be recorded as deviation from council protocol. John's voice remained steady. It will be recorded as adaptation to real conditions. Serafina closed her eyes briefly, then reopened them as she initiated system authorization. Across the residence network, command pathways restructured in real time, compressing decision latency between detection and execution layers. For a brief moment, nothing appeared to change externally. Then the system responses recalibrated, not faster in perception, but more direct in flow, eliminating intermediate hesitation layers that had previously been considered essential safeguards. Serafina observed the change with measured silence. John did not acknowledge it beyond a slight shift in attention, as if confirming alignment rather than witnessing transformation. The orbital display updated once more. The movement patterns along the contested corridor adjusted subtly in response to the new system behavior. Not retreating, not advancing, but reorganizing, as if recalculating the nature of the system they were now interacting with. Serafina stood beside John, both of them watching the same projection. The realization formed without announcement, without declaration, without ceremony. Whatever was approaching was no longer interacting with isolated systems. It was beginning to interact with something that was learning to respond as a unified structure. The sixth cycle of observation began with an unusual stillness across the orbital corridor, not a reduction in activity, but a refinement of it, as if the surrounding systems had begun to prioritize observation over movement. In the sky residence, Serafina Villar stood before a suspended holographic model of the contested space, now layered with increasingly complex behavioral mappings generated by the revised response architecture she had authorized earlier. Each update no longer appeared as isolated data points, but as interconnected structures forming patterns of intent rather than motion. John Miller remained nearby, not actively interfacing with any system, but observing the evolution of the model with a focus that suggested he was tracking more than just external activity. Serafina broke the silence first. "The pattern density has increased again," she said, "but there is no corresponding escalation in energy output." John nodded slightly. "That is expected," he replied. "Energy output is a secondary indicator. They are adjusting to your system's responsiveness, not your defenses." She turned toward him. "You are suggesting they're learning from our reaction cycles." "Not learning in the human sense," John clarified. "Adapting structure based on feedback efficiency. Every response you generate teaches them something about your decision latency." The holographic projection shifted again, this time showing clusters of orbital activity reorganizing into asymmetrical formations that mirrored previous response distributions from Elorian defense protocols. Serafina noticed it immediately. "They are replicating our response patterns," she said quietly. John's expression remained unchanged. "They are not replicating," he said. "They are reflecting. That is different." The distinction lingered in the air, subtle but significant. Serafina accessed deeper analytical layers, running comparative overlays against historical engagement data from prior border incidents. The system returned a troubling correlation. Each time the residence or associated command structures adjusted response latency or decision flow, the external movement patterns adapted within hours, becoming more efficient, more distributed, and less predictable in spatial configuration. "This is not a static threat," she said finally. "It is a responsive system." John gave a slight nod. "Yes, and now it is interacting with your adjustments directly." A secondary advisory channel activated, this time from the Central Elorian Council itself. The projection stabilized into the formal presence of senior strategic representatives, their expressions controlled but marked by increasing concern. One of them spoke first, referencing the recent unauthorized adjustments to command latency structures within the Sky resident systems. The tone was not accusatory, but firmly procedural. Serafina responded with measured clarity, outlining the necessity of adaptive restructuring based on observed external behavior patterns. The council member listened without interruption, then requested justification for deviation from established multi-tier approval protocols. Before Serafina could respond, John stepped forward slightly into the projection field, not physically, but within auditory range of the communication system. "Your protocols assume stability in adversary modeling," he said calmly. "But the system you're observing does not maintain stable configuration long enough for static modeling to remain valid." The council member paused. "And you are," he asked, "offering a different classification?" John considered the phrasing briefly. "I am offering recognition that classification itself may be the limiting factor," he replied. "If every response you generate is based on predefined categories, then anything outside those categories will always appear unpredictable rather than structured." The projection fell silent for a moment, the kind of silence that indicated processing rather than disagreement. Serafina watched the exchange carefully, aware that John was not attempting to override command structure, but to reframe the assumptions underlying it. The council eventually responded with procedural caution, instructing continued observation and controlled adjustment only within predefined parameters. The projection dissolved shortly after, leaving the residence once again in its ambient operational state. Serafina remained still for several seconds. You are not attempting to take control of our systems, she said finally. John shook his head slightly. Control is not the objective, he replied. Alignment is. She narrowed her gaze slightly. Alignment with what? John turned his attention toward the orbital horizon visible through the transparent structure. With reality as it is forming, not as it was assumed. A subtle shift occurred in the residence lighting, adjusting to the changing external environmental data. Serafina noticed that even the system seemed to be recalibrating its baseline assumptions more frequently now, responding not to commands, but to structural coherence across multiple data streams. Another alert activated, this time lower priority, but persistent. It indicated a convergence of orbital movement patterns into a coordinated formation across 3 previously independent observation clusters. Not an attack formation, not a retreat, but something that resembled structured observation consolidation. Serafina reviewed the updated model. They're synchronizing their observation nodes, she said. John nodded once. They are reducing informational noise between independent points of view. She looked at him more directly now. That is what we did with our systems, she said. We centralized response, coordination. Yes, John replied. And now they're doing the same, but in reverse. Instead of centralizing control, they're centralizing awareness. The implications settled heavily, not as threat, but as structural realization. Serafina returned her gaze to the holographic projection, now showing near-perfect symmetry between external movement clusters and internal response recalibrations. The distinction between observer and observed was beginning to blur at the system level. John spoke again, more quietly. This is the point where most systems fail to recognize they are no longer separate from what they are analyzing. Serafina did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the continuous feedback loop forming between the resident systems and external patterns, each adjusting to the other in increasingly refined cycles. The sky residence was no longer just a command environment or diplomatic structure. It was becoming part of the same adaptive field it was attempting to interpret. And for the first time, Serafina considered that the greatest unknown in the situation was not the external system they were observing, but the emerging system that was forming between observation and response itself. The moment of escalation did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a structural shift in every active projection across the sky resident systems. The orbital corridor display, previously stable in its layered analytical state, began to fragment into parallel interpretations as incoming data streams increased beyond standard consolidation thresholds. Serafina was already present in the central chamber when the alert propagated, her attention immediately locking onto the sudden divergence in pattern coherence. John Miller stood several meters away, yet his posture changed almost imperceptibly, as if he had anticipated the transition before the system had formally registered it. The residence lighting adjusted to emergency analytical mode, not signaling danger in the traditional sense, but indicating maximum cognitive load allocation across all active systems. Serafina initiated full-scale observation synchronization. Report, she said, her voice controlled but sharper than before. The tactical display responded with layered updates. The synchronized orbital clusters that had been forming over the past cycles had completed a structural transition. Instead of dispersed observational nodes, they now exhibited coordinated triangulation behavior around a defined spatial corridor, maintaining distance but preserving relational geometry. John approached the projection without haste. They have completed phase alignment, he said quietly. Serafina turned toward him. Phase alignment with what objective? John did not immediately answer. His focus remained on the shifting geometry of the orbital map. With each other, he said finally. They are no longer independent observation units reacting to external stimuli. They are operating as a unified perception system. The statement was simple, but its implication caused a subtle recalibration across Serafina's interpretive framework. That is not standard fleet behavior, she said. John nodded once. It is not fleet behavior at all. It is distributed cognition. The phrase hung in the air longer than expected. The residence system attempted to classify the new pattern under existing threat matrices, but returned insufficient categorization matches. Serafina reviewed the system feedback, then accessed historical analogs. None matched the current structural configuration. Not even previous coalition encounters reflected this level of synchronized observational integration. A second alert followed, this time originating from internal residence monitoring systems. The Sky residence itself had begun to register reciprocal pattern adjustment, not as a result of external command input, but as response adaptation to persistent external observation symmetry. Serafina stepped closer to the interface. Our system is reacting to them, she said. John corrected gently. Your system is interacting with them. The distinction was immediate and unsettling. The holographic display shifted again, now showing mirrored feedback loops between orbital clusters and residence response architecture. Each adjustment on one side triggered recalibration on the other, not in escalation, but in refinement. Serafina realized that neither side was advancing in a traditional sense. They were synchronizing through iterative observation cycles. This should not be possible without centralized command directive, she said. John shook his head slightly. You are assuming command is required for coordination, he replied. But coordination can emerge when systems prioritize consistency over control. A brief silence followed. The residence ambient systems dimmed slightly as processing resources were redirected toward high-fidelity pattern analysis. Serafina felt the weight of the realization forming gradually rather than abruptly. If this continues, she said, we will no longer be able to distinguish between observer and observed at system level. John's gaze remained fixed on the projection. That distinction is already dissolving, he said. At that moment, the orbital visualization underwent a final structural transition. The clusters ceased behaving as external entities and instead formed a continuous feedback lattice extending from orbital space into the residence system architecture itself. The boundary markers that had previously defined external and internal domains began to lose operational clarity. Serafina took a slow breath, maintaining composure while recalibrating her understanding of the situation in real time. We are no longer analyzing them, she said quietly. We are participating in the same system. John nodded once, as if confirming a conclusion rather than observing a change. Yes, he said. And now the question is not what they are doing. The question is whether this system stabilizes or continues to evolve without fixed boundary conditions. Serafina looked toward the transparent horizon beyond the residence, with a planet below rotated in silence, unaware of the transformation occurring above its atmosphere. For the first time since the arrangement began, she understood that the greatest shift was not in political alignment or military posture, but in the dissolution of separation itself. And within that realization, she began to suspect that John Miller had not been reacting to events from the beginning. He had been anticipating the emergence of a system that was only now beginning to recognize itself. The transition into full system convergence did not produce any immediate visual rupture, but instead initiated a gradual compression of interpretive layers across every active interface within the Sky residence. What had previously been a structured separation between orbital observation systems and internal residence analytics was now functioning as a continuous bidirectional field of information exchange. Serafina stood at the center of the main chamber, her posture steady, though every indicator around her suggested that the environment itself was no longer operating under static architectural assumptions. John Miller remained close to the primary projection field, his attention fixed on the evolving lattice of synchronized data that now extended beyond traditional mapping into something closer to distributed awareness modeling. The orbital clusters, once distinct in their movement patterns, were now aligned in a formation that no longer resembled surveillance or reconnaissance. Instead, it resembled recognition. Serafina spoke slowly, her voice measured to maintain clarity within the shifting analytical environment. System feedback is no longer directional, she said. It is reciprocal. John nodded once. That is the correct interpretation, he replied. The system has reached closed-loop observation equilibrium. The phrase triggered immediate recalibration across the resident's interpretation core. Serafina accessed deeper layers of analysis, confirming that external orbital structures were no longer merely transmitting data toward the residents. They were also receiving processed, interpretive feedback from it, adjusting their own structural alignment in response to internal analytical refinements. The implication was no longer theoretical. The distinction between observer and system under observation had dissolved into continuous exchange. A new alert emerged from the Central Diplomatic Authority Network. The Elorian Council projection activated without delay, but the transmission was unstable, fragmented across multiple synchronization nodes, as if the communication system itself was adapting to the same structural shift. Several council representatives appeared in overlapping visual layers, their expressions controlled but increasingly uncertain. One of them spoke with deliberate caution, referencing the unauthorized emergence of cross-domain interpretive feedback loops between orbital observation clusters and residents' analytical infrastructure. The tone suggested procedural concern rather than accusation, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Serafina responded with formal precision, outlining the confirmed state of bidirectional system adaptation and the absence of destabilizing anomalies within control parameters. However, before the Council could issue further procedural directives, John stepped slightly forward into the shared communication field. His presence did not interrupt the transmission, but it altered the interpretive focus of the interface itself. "You are still treating this as two separate systems interacting," he said calmly. "That is no longer accurate." One of the Council members narrowed their focus. "Clarify your assessment." John did not hesitate. "There are no longer separate systems," he said. "There is only a single adaptive structure forming through continuous feedback integration between what you define as internal and external domains." The projection flickered subtly as processing systems struggled to reconcile the statement with established classification frameworks. Serafina observed the reaction carefully, noting that even the Council's interpretive delay was now influenced by the same feedback architecture that had begun within the residents. The Council eventually attempted to reassert procedural control, instructing a temporary suspension of non-essential adaptive adjustments pending full review. However, the command itself propagated through the system in a transformed state, encountering resistance not from external override, but from internal structural inconsistency. The Sky residents did not reject the instruction. It simply could not resolve it without first integrating the broader feedback environment into its operational baseline. Serafina felt the weight of the realization fully settle now. The system they had initiated adjustments within was no longer confined to residents' infrastructure or orbital observation clusters. It had extended into the interpretive frameworks of the governing council itself. She turned slightly toward John. "This was not in any strategic projection model," she said. John replied without looking away from the evolving lattice display. "It would not be," he said, "because projection models assume boundaries that are no longer stable." A long silence followed, during which the resident's lighting adjusted itself repeatedly in small increments, responding to subtle shifts in external and internal data synchronization. Outside the transparent structure, the planet below continued its rotation, unchanged in appearance, yet increasingly irrelevant as a point of reference for system definition. Serafina studied the convergence patterns now visible across all layers of the projection. What had begun as coordinated orbital observation had evolved into something that no longer fit conventional classification. It was not an invasion, not an alliance, and not a simulation. It was an emergent interpretive system formed through mutual adaptation of previously independent structures. John finally spoke again, his voice calm but absolute in its clarity. "The system will continue to evolve," he said. "The only variable left is whether you attempt to contain it, or allow it to stabilize through continued integration." Serafina did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the full extent of the feedback lattice, now spanning orbital space, residence infrastructure, and council interpretation layers simultaneously. For the first time, she understood that the original question of peace, marriage, or political stability had become irrelevant. What remained was a single unfolding structure that was learning how to define itself through every response it received. And at the center of that structure stood John Miller, not as an anomaly within the system, but as the reference point through which the system itself had begun to understand its own existence. The final convergence event did not announce itself through any traditional signal. Instead, every active system connected to the Sky residence, the orbital observation clusters, and the Elorian Council network reached a point of complete interpretive synchronization where no further distinction could be maintained between observation, response, or analysis. Serafina Voltaire stood at the center of the main chamber, her posture unchanged, though every layer of the environment around her had become fully integrated into a single continuous informational structure. The holographic displays no longer functioned as separate interfaces. They had merged into a unified spatial field of dynamic perception, where orbital data, internal diagnostics, and council communications existed as variations of the same underlying pattern. John Miller remained beside the central projection space, not as an operator or participant in the traditional sense, but as a stable reference point within the evolving system. His presence did not alter the data flow. It anchored it. Serafina spoke softly, her voice measured against the overwhelming coherence of the environment. There are no longer distinct layers of system hierarchy, she said. John nodded once. Correct, he replied. Hierarchy assumes separation. Separation no longer exists. The orbital visualization expanded outward, not physically, but conceptually, as if the system itself was redefining the boundaries of observation to include all connected domains simultaneously. The Elorian Council projection activated one final time, but instead of fragmented communication nodes, it appeared as a unified analytical presence. Their expressions were no longer divided by location or interface delay. They were synchronized, not by command, but by shared interpretive alignment with the same emergent structure. One of the council members spoke, but the tone was no longer procedural. It was reflective. The statement acknowledged that the system had evolved beyond its original parameters and could no longer be contained within predefined classifications of diplomatic, military, or observational frameworks. Serafina listened without interruption. When the projection stabilized, she finally spoke. If this is no longer a controlled system, she said, then what defines its boundaries? John considered the question for a moment, not as a calculation, but as a structural interpretation. There are no fixed boundaries, he said, only levels of coherence. The system exists where coherence is maintained. Serafina turned toward the projection field, observing the final integrated lattice of orbital, residential, and council-level data streams. It no longer resembled a network in the traditional sense. It resembled a single adaptive consciousness distributed across multiple points of observation. And what happens to intent, she asked. John's response was immediate. Intent becomes distributed, he said. It is no longer centralized in decision points. It emerges from interaction between all connected elements. A long silence followed. Not empty, but complete. The Sky residence systems stabilized into a state of equilibrium that was not static, but continuously self-adjusting, maintaining coherence through constant feedback exchange. Outside the transparent structure, the planet below continued its rotation, now functionally decoupled from the system above it, no longer a central reference point for analysis or decision-making. Serafina stepped closer to the projection field, her gaze steady. Then the marriage contract, she said quietly, was not the binding structure. John shook his head slightly. No, he said. It was only the first point of connection that allowed the system to recognize compatibility between two independent frameworks. The realization settled not as shock, but as completion of an analytical cycle that had been unfolding since the first moment of integration. Serafina finally understood that the arrangement had never been about diplomacy, alliance, or symbolic union. It had been the initial interface through which two fundamentally different interpretive systems began to align into a shared operational structure. She turned to John. "You knew this would happen," she said. John met her gaze calmly. "I recognized the possibility," he replied. The outcome depended on whether adaptation was resisted or allowed to stabilize. The system around them maintained perfect coherence. Every data stream synchronized across orbital, residential, and council domains. There was no longer any distinction between observer and observed, command and response, system and environment. Everything existed within a single continuous adaptive field. Serafina looked once more toward the horizon beyond the residence, where the planet remained unchanged in appearance. Though now fully integrated into a broader system of interpretation, she could no longer separate from herself. And in that final moment of clarity, she understood that John Miller had never been the center of disruption. He had been the point at which separation itself ceased to function, allowing something entirely new to emerge from the space between control and understanding.